I never imagined that something as ordinary as planning a backyard party could be the beginning of a storm that would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. My name is Emily. I've always seen myself as a devoted wife to David and a loving mother to our only son, Lucas. We lived in a modest home in the suburbs, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of routine, a rhythm I once cherished. Our days were predictable. David left for work early every morning, always dressed in his crisp shirts and purposeful stride, already deep in thought about some project or deadline. Lucas, full of life and curiosity, was finishing his final year of high school, often rushing out the door with a half-eaten piece of toast in his hand and a quick kiss on my cheek. And me, I stayed behind, taking care of the house, the errands, the 1,000 invisible tasks that held our lives together. There was comfort in that repetition. I prided myself on being the anchor of our little family, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. Every week was marked by familiar rhythms: laundry on Mondays, grocery shopping on Thursdays, and quiet dinners on Sundays when David was home early enough to join us. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Our life might have lacked excitement, but it was stable, and for a long time, that was enough. But deep down, something had been shifting. There were moments, often in the stillness of the evening when the dishes were done and the house was quiet, that I'd feel an ache, an emptiness I couldn't quite name. David had become more distant over the years, his time consumed by work and ambition. Our conversations had dwindled to updates about bills and Lucas's schedule. Affection had become a routine, like everything else. I often brushed those feelings aside, reminding myself that all marriages go through phases. That perhaps this quiet, comfortable distance was simply part of being together for so long. I had convinced myself that I didn't need more. That the longing for something different, something deeper, was selfish or unrealistic. And then came the graduation party. A milestone I had been looking forward to for months, not just as a celebration for Lucas, but as a chance to bring joy and life back into our home. I threw myself into the preparations, determined to make it perfect, not just for him, but for all of us. Maybe, I thought, it could be a moment to reconnect. A reminder of the love that had once burned so brightly between David and me. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, was that it wouldn't be David who reminded me what it felt like to be seen. Or wanted. Or alive. It was the kind of afternoon that held a quiet charm, warm sunlight filtering through the branches of our backyard trees, casting dappled shadows across the grass. I stood on a slightly rickety ladder, reaching high to string delicate lights across the pergola. The decorations for Lucas's graduation celebration were nearly complete, and I was determined to make every detail just right. David, true to form, was still at the office, buried in another last-minute project. I told myself I didn't mind handling everything alone. I always did, but as I stretched upward, fingers fumbling with a strand of lights, I felt the ladder shift slightly beneath me. A ripple of unease passed through my chest. Before I could adjust my stance, a voice behind me startled me. "Need a hand, Mrs. Thompson?" The voice was familiar, deeper than I remembered, but unmistakable. I turned quickly, one hand still gripping the ladder for balance, and there he was, Jake, Susan's son. The boy I had watched grow up alongside Lucas. Only he wasn't a boy anymore. The years had changed him, broadened his shoulders, sharpened his features, and given him a quiet self-assurance that caught me completely off guard. "Oh, Jake. You surprised me," I said, laughing softly, trying to still both the latter and the sudden flutter in my chest. "What brings you here?" He smiled, and there was something easy and genuine about it. "Mom said you might need some help setting up. When I saw you up there, I figured I should at least make sure you didn't fall." Grateful for the excuse to step down, I carefully climbed off the ladder. "Well, I suppose I wouldn't turn down an extra pair of hands." He reached out instinctively to steady the ladder as I descended. Our hands brushed, just briefly, but long enough for something to stir in the air between us. A flicker. I told myself it was just surprise, nothing more. I led him to the patio where decorations were strewn across the table. "I need to get these up around the yard. It's not much, but it's hard doing it alone." "No problem at all," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's make it look amazing." "Call me Emily," I added, smiling. "You're not a kid anymore." He paused, then nodded. "All right, Emily." Side by side, we worked through the afternoon, hanging lights, arranging tables, and tying ribbons. I asked about his classes, his plans for the summer. His answers were thoughtful, engaging, and beneath the polite small talk was something else, a sense of ease that felt different. Familiar, yet not. From time to time, our hands would meet as we passed decorations or reached for the same spool of ribbon. Each contact, however fleeting, made my pulse quicken. I scolded myself for noticing. For letting my thoughts drift. This was Jake. Susan's son. Practically family. But something had changed, and I didn't yet understand what it meant. At one point, as he smoothed a tablecloth, he glanced up and said, "Lucas is lucky. Not every mom would go all out like this." His gaze lingered for a second longer than expected, and I felt a warmth rise to my cheeks. "I just want the day to be special," I replied, though my voice sounded quieter than usual. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard, we stepped back to admire our work. The decorations danced gently in the breeze, and for a moment, all I could feel was gratitude, for his help, for the company, but also something more complex, something I wasn't ready to name. "See you at the party tomorrow, Emily," he said before leaving, his voice calm, but his eyes holding something unspoken. "See you," I replied, watching him walk away, heart filled with a curious mixture of appreciation and something far more unsettling. It had only been an afternoon, but somehow, it felt like the beginning of a shift I couldn't yet explain, or ignore. The morning of Lucas's graduation party arrived with a quiet brightness. I woke early, unable to sleep, the anticipation, and something else I couldn't quite define, resting heavily on my chest. The decorations Jake and I had arranged the day before glimmered softly in the sunlight, like a promise of the evening to come. Everything was in place, the tables dressed in clean linens, balloons swaying in the gentle breeze, and soft lights strung delicately across the yard. It should have felt like an ordinary day, one filled with family, laughter, and the joy of a milestone, but beneath my practiced movements, there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite silence. My thoughts kept drifting to Jake. Not in a way I had planned. Not in a way I knew how to control. I reminded myself that it was all innocent. That he was just helping. That I was simply tired. As the afternoon faded into evening, the backyard began to fill with familiar faces, neighbors, relatives, classmates, and friends. Lucas beamed as he greeted his guests, his energy contagious, and seeing him so full of life filled me with a quiet, aching pride. David arrived shortly after, smiling in the way he always did when in public, warm, polished, distracted. He introduced himself to a few of his colleagues he'd brought along and quickly fell into conversation, already immersed in networking. I stayed busy, flitting between conversations, offering drinks, refreshing the food table, doing everything a good hostess should. It was easier that way. Easier than acknowledging the emotions pressing beneath the surface. Then I saw him, Jake, standing near the refreshment table, his easy smile drawing in those around him. He looked completely at ease, effortlessly charming, like he belonged wherever he stood. And yet when our eyes met across the crowd, something passed between us. Not words. Not a gesture. Just a knowing, a quiet recognition. I turned away almost instantly, returning to a tray of appetizers, my heart picking up pace despite the calm expression I maintained. But I could feel it, his presence lingering like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. Later, as I carried an empty tray toward the kitchen, I sensed someone fall into step beside me. "You've been running around non-stop," Jake said lightly, his voice low enough to blend with the hum of the party. I glanced at him, my tone calm though I was suddenly more aware of everything around me. That's the role of a hostess. Plenty of things to keep track of. "Let me take that," he offered, gently reaching for the tray in my hands. Our fingers brushed. Again, that same quiet electricity, soft and unexpected, surged between us. I drew my hand back just slightly, but the moment lingered longer than it should have. "Thank you," I said, trying to maintain the careful balance I had built around myself. Jake gave a small smile, not pressing further, but his next words stayed with me. "Don't forget to enjoy the night too, Emily. You've done something beautiful here." Then he walked away, blending once again into the crowd, leaving me standing in the fading glow of the evening light, trying to steady a heart that wasn't supposed to feel so awake. The rest of the night passed in a blur of toasts, photos, and hugs. Yet even as I smiled for the camera or passed another drink, I could feel the thread that had begun to weave between us. It wasn't loud or disruptive. It was quiet. Subtle. A glance here. A pause there. The kind of presence you only notice because you feel it before you even see it. As the guests trickled out and the yard returned to stillness, I walked alone across the lawn, the fairy lights above twinkling like stars. And though the celebration had ended, a different sort of story had just begun, one I didn't yet understand, and wasn't sure I was ready to face. But I could no longer deny that something inside me had shifted. Something I hadn't felt in years. The day after the celebration was oddly still. The yard, once vibrant with laughter and conversation, now bore only the traces of festivity, scattered streamers caught in the hedges, footprints in the grass, and a faint echo of music that seemed to linger in the air. I moved slowly through the quiet morning, collecting empty glasses and tidying up, the silence both a comfort and a weight. David had already returned to his routine, dressed in a crisp shirt before I had even come downstairs. He left with a quick peck on the cheek and a mumbled reminder about a meeting. Lucas was still asleep, likely worn out from the night before. And I found myself pausing often, staring a moment too long at the decorations Jake and I had hung together, my thoughts drifting to the warmth in his eyes, the way he had said my name. I told myself again it had meant nothing. It was simply the intimacy of shared effort. A natural response to kindness. But the feeling that lingered wasn't one I could explain away so easily. By mid-afternoon, I decided to step out, craving the comfort of a familiar place. There was a cafe downtown that I often visited, a small, quiet spot tucked between an art store and a flower shop. I liked it for its quiet atmosphere, the soft hum of conversation, and the scent of fresh coffee that seemed to settle deep into your soul. As I stepped inside, the chime above the door rang softly. I exhaled, already feeling more grounded, and then I saw him. Jake. He was seated near the window, a laptop open before him, one hand resting against his temple as he stared at the screen in deep concentration. There was something natural about him being there, as if he belonged to the space. I hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether to approach or quietly slip back out before he noticed. But he looked up. His expression shifted instantly, surprise, then a slow, genuine smile. "Emily," he said, standing slightly. What a nice surprise. There was no graceful way to retreat now. "Hi," I replied, walking toward him with a cautious smile. "Didn't expect to see you here. I come here sometimes when I need a change of pace," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Join me?" I hesitated for only a heartbeat before sitting down. The conversation began tentatively, but soon unfolded with ease. We talked about the party, how proud Lucas must be, the books he was reading for school. It was the kind of conversation that didn't need effort, words flowing naturally, silences feeling gentle rather than awkward. At one point, Jake tilted his head, studying me with quiet thoughtfulness. "You don't seem like the person I imagined growing up," he said gently. "Not in a bad way. Just different." I raised an eyebrow, unsure what he meant. "How so?" He smiled faintly. "I guess I always thought of you as someone distant. Reserved. But you're not like that at all." His words settled somewhere deep within me, in a place that had been quiet for a long time. "I think people change," I said softly. "Sometimes life just pulls pieces of us inward." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "Then I hope those pieces find their way out again." The cafe grew quieter around us. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting soft golden patterns on the pavement. I realized, with a mix of comfort and discomfort, that I hadn't felt so seen in a long time. Eventually, I glanced at the clock and stood. "I should be going. Thank you for the company." Jake stood as well. "Of course. It was nice." Our hands brushed briefly as I gathered my things, the contact light but unmistakably real. "Take care, Emily," he said, his voice low. "You too, Jake." As I stepped out into the afternoon light, my heart was steady but full of unspoken things. I reminded myself again that nothing had happened. It was just a conversation. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Not in action, perhaps, but in thought, in the quiet shifts of feeling that were beginning to reshape the way I saw my world. The days that followed settled into their usual rhythm, yet something had changed, subtly, quietly, like a shift in the wind you only notice when you stop to listen. I moved through my routines, folding laundry, prepping meals, checking in with Lucas about his summer plans. But each task seemed to carry a weight, as if I were walking through a memory I hadn't yet made sense of. I found myself thinking about the cafe. The way Jake had looked at me, not with judgment or expectation, but with curiosity. Attentiveness. It was the kind of gaze that didn't demand anything, yet somehow unraveled parts of me I had long tucked away. David, as always, was immersed in work. He was kind in the way someone who is always thinking of something else can be, present in body, but never quite reaching me. We still shared meals, but our conversations were brief, efficient. "Did you remember to pay the phone bill? Lucas wants to apply for another scholarship." Practical words, spoken with care but without connection. And in the quiet moments when I sat alone at the kitchen table, or lingered over a cup of tea in the early hours before sunrise, my thoughts would circle back to Jake. Not in the way I wanted them to. Not as a fantasy. But as a reminder, a mirror to something I had forgotten about myself. It began with a message. Jake, hey Emily. Just checking in, how's your computer holding up? Simple. Polite. Innocent. But my heart quickened all the same. I stared at the screen for longer than I needed to, unsure of what to say. Eventually, I typed back, Emily, still running perfectly. Thank you again. His reply came almost immediately. Jake, anytime. Really, I should have left it there. Closed the app. Gone back to my afternoon chores. But instead, my fingers hovered, and then I typed something more. Emily, I appreciated your company too, more than I expected. There was a pause this time, just long enough for me to feel uncertain. And then, Jake, same here. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even flirtation. But it was a door left slightly ajar. Over the following days, we messaged here and there, book recommendations, casual thoughts, the kind of exchanges that seemed safe on the surface. Yet underneath, there was a current. A feeling of being seen, remembered, acknowledged. Each message felt like a quiet pull. And even though I knew I was walking a delicate line, I didn't stop. One Saturday, with David at the office and Lucas out with friends, Jake asked if I wanted to meet. Just a walk, he said. There's a quiet park on the edge of town. No pressure, just thought it might be nice. I hesitated. Everything in my mind told me it was a bad idea. But something in my heart, in that silent aching part of me that had gone ignored for years, whispered back, go. When I arrived, he was already there, leaning against a tree with his hands in his pockets. He looked up and smiled, not wide, not theatrical, just soft. Real. We walked without destination, just moving through the quiet trails, letting the rhythm of our steps carry us forward. At first, we talked about nothing in particular. But slowly, the pauses grew longer, the space between our words filled with something unsaid. Eventually, we reached a quiet bend in the path, overlooking a small pond where the water shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun. We stopped there, not speaking for a moment. Then Jake turned to me. I haven't stopped thinking about you, he said gently. I looked away, not ready to face the storm his words stirred in me. Jake, I started, my voice low. This can't go anywhere. I know, he said. I know it's complicated. I'm not asking for anything. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes, earnest and vulnerable. I just needed to say it. That you matter. That you're not invisible. I closed my eyes, the wind moving softly through the trees around us. His words weren't romantic. They weren't even suggestive. But they reached into a part of me I hadn't let anyone touch in a long time. We stood in silence, side by side, watching the ripples on the water. Nothing more happened. No promises were made. No boundaries were crossed. But something had already changed. Not in the world around us, but in me. The walk in the park stayed with me long after I returned home. I moved through the evening like a shadow of myself, present, responsive, but detached. David had left a note on the counter, something about a delayed meeting and grabbing dinner with a client. Lucas was still out, likely celebrating the last breath of high school freedom. And I was alone with the echo of a conversation I hadn't planned to have. Jake's words lingered in my thoughts, not because they were grand or confessional, but because they were true. Simple. Clear. You're not invisible. I realized how long it had been since someone had said something like that. Not just said it, but meant it. And I hated how much that mattered. I spent the next few days trying to reclaim my sense of balance. I cooked with more care, tried to reconnect with David in small ways, a question about his work, a touch on the shoulder, a cup of tea waiting when he got home. He always thanked me. He was never unkind. But the distance remained, like a pane of glass between us, clear, but cold. Every time I passed the park or the cafe, a part of me stirred. Not because I expected to see Jake, but because some quiet part of me hoped I might. The longing wasn't for him exactly, it was for the way I had felt in his presence, visible, alive, open. I didn't reach out. And for a while, neither did he. But then, one late afternoon, a message appeared. Jake, hope your week's been kind. I saw something that reminded me of our walk. Thought of you. My heart responded before my mind could intervene. Emily, it has been. Thank you for checking in. I've thought about that walk too. There was a pause. Then, Jake, would it be all right to see you again? Just to talk. Nothing more. It should have been easy to say no. But the ache in my chest, the one I'd been trying to ignore, answered for me. Emily, all right. Just to talk. We met again, this time in the same cafe as before. The corner table. 2 cups of coffee. The same quiet air between us. But this time, the conversation went deeper. Jake spoke about his uncertainties, about feeling like he was standing at a crossroads, unsure of which direction to choose. And I, slowly, spoke about the silence in my marriage, the slow fading of connection, and the part of me I'd begun to lose in the process. I didn't mean to let it happen, I said, fingers wrapped tightly around my cup. But one day I woke up and realized I was living beside someone, not with them. Jake listened without judgment, his eyes steady, patient. You're not alone in that, he said quietly. A lot of people feel that. They just never say it out loud. I nodded, and for a moment, we simply sat. No roles, no expectations. Just 2 people sharing a truth that didn't need explanation. When we stood to leave, he didn't reach for my hand. He didn't linger too long. He only looked at me with the kind of expression that says, I see you. And I respect whatever happens next. As I walked back to my car, the air felt heavier. Not with guilt, but with clarity. I was caught between 2 lives, the one I had built, and the one I was beginning to question. And though nothing had changed on the outside, I knew something inside me had begun to shift in a way that couldn't be undone. The days moved forward, but inside, I remained still, suspended between clarity and confusion. From the outside, everything seemed normal. The house was tidy, meals were served on time, and conversations unfolded as expected. But beneath the quiet structure of our life, cracks had begun to form. Not loud. Not visible. But there, David continued to bury himself in work. His presence was courteous, his gestures habitual, but his mind was always elsewhere. Some evenings we sat on the same couch, but it felt as though miles stretched between us. He would scroll through emails while I folded laundry or read quietly by the lamp's soft light. It wasn't coldness exactly, it was distance. The kind that builds over years when no one notices the silence growing. I began to feel the loneliness more acutely. Not just the absence of intimacy, but the absence of curiosity. I missed being asked how I was feeling, what I was thinking. I missed being noticed. And so, in that growing space of quiet longing, Jake's memory returned, more often than I wanted to admit. I didn't seek him out. I didn't have to. His presence had settled in the corners of my thoughts like a familiar breeze, unexpected but welcome. Then one evening, while I was preparing dinner, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. "Jake, you crossed my mind today. I hope that's okay." I stared at the message, my hands frozen above the cutting board. What do you do when someone simply sees you? After a long pause, I replied, "Emily, it is. And thank you for being thoughtful." The exchange was short, respectful. But it was enough to stir something that had lain dormant for far too long. That night, David came home late. He dropped his keys on the table and offered a distracted smile. "Sorry, meeting ran over." "Looks great in here," he said, gesturing toward the dinner I'd plated. He sat, ate, and asked about Lucas. I answered. We moved through the evening like well-rehearsed actors, knowing our lines, but no longer believing the story. And as I lay in bed beside him later, staring at the ceiling, I realized something painful. I no longer felt present in my own life. I was going through the motions, waiting for a feeling that hadn't come in years. I didn't want grand gestures. I wanted depth. Connection. Something real. I didn't know what the future would look like. I didn't know what role Jake might play in it, or if he would play one at all. But I knew this: I couldn't keep living behind glass. Something had to change. And whether that change would come through confrontation, confession, or quiet redirection, I wasn't sure yet. But the stillness was no longer bearable. The ache had grown too loud. The next morning, sunlight filtered gently through the curtains, casting soft patterns across our bedroom floor. I lay awake long before the alarm sounded, eyes open, mind heavy. David stirred beside me but didn't speak, just reached for his phone, as always, to check messages and schedules. The quiet between us had become routine, but it no longer felt neutral. It felt loud. I moved through the day carefully, almost methodically, washing dishes, checking in with Lucas, watering the garden, but every motion carried with it a sense of looming truth. I could no longer pretend everything was fine. I could no longer carry the weight of unspoken thoughts and unlived emotion. That evening, after Lucas had gone upstairs, I found David at the dining table with his laptop open. He looked tired, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. I hesitated for a moment in the doorway, my fingers brushing the edge of a chair for balance. "David," I said softly. "Can we talk?" He looked up, immediately alert. "Of course. Is everything all right?" I sat across from him, folded my hands together, and took a steadying breath. "There's something I need to say. And it's not easy." His expression shifted. His eyes searched mine for answers before I even began. "I've felt lost," I admitted. "For a long time now. Like we've been living beside each other instead of with each other. And I've tried to push it aside, to carry on. But I can't anymore." David set his laptop aside, his full attention now on me. "Emily, what are you saying?" I met his gaze and held it. "I've been spending time with someone. Not in the way you might assume, but enough to make me realize how far apart we've grown." His brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. I could see the weight of my words settle into him, slow and sharp. "Nothing happened that crossed a line," I continued, my voice trembling. But it made me aware of how alone I felt. How unseen. And how much I'd been needing to be reached. Silence filled the space between us. It wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was heavy, like fog. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand across his jaw. Was it someone I know? I hesitated, then nodded. Yes. He closed his eyes for a moment, the tension in his shoulders rising, then falling. Emily. I didn't know you felt this way. I thought things were just settled. I know, I whispered. That's the problem. We stopped noticing. He looked at me, really looked, and I saw something shift in him. A quiet sadness. A dawning awareness. I don't want to lose us, he said, his voice lower than I'd expected. But I also know we can't pretend this didn't happen. I don't want to pretend, I replied. But I want to understand how we got here. And if we can find our way back. For a long time, we said nothing more. Just sat there in the soft dimness of our dining room, two people finally stepping out from behind the script we'd been performing for too long. Eventually, David nodded slowly. Then let's try. Together. But honestly this time, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding escaped me. And in that moment, despite the pain, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The days following that conversation felt quieter, but not in the same way as before. It was a different kind of quiet, no longer rooted in avoidance, but in processing. David and I moved around each other gently, both aware that something had shifted, that we were standing on uncertain ground. We weren't pretending anymore. We began to speak in fragments, small, honest confessions that emerged over coffee, during walks around the block, or while folding laundry. I didn't know how lonely you felt. I thought if I kept providing, it would be enough. I missed you, even when you were right there. It was uncomfortable, sometimes painful. But there was also a strange relief in it, a sense that, perhaps for the first time in a long while, we were talking to each other, not through each other. David suggested counseling. At first, I hesitated. The idea of sitting across from a stranger and unraveling years of quiet disappointment felt daunting. But deep down, I knew we needed help. Not because we were broken, but because we didn't know how to rebuild on our own. Our first session was tense. The counselor, calm and observant, created a space where nothing had to be hidden. David spoke with restraint, but his words carried weight. I spoke with caution, unsure how much to say, afraid of reopening wounds that hadn't fully healed. But as the sessions continued, a rhythm formed. Slowly, we began to untangle the history between us, not just the pain, but the patterns that had led us to disconnect. Outside those sessions, we made small efforts to reconnect. David started coming home earlier, leaving his phone in another room during dinner. I stopped filling every silence with busyness. We tried to be present. Some days were easier than others. Sometimes we stumbled. But each effort, no matter how small, was a thread weaving us back together. Lucas noticed the change, though he didn't say much. His smiles came more freely, and the tension in our home began to soften. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he casually said, "You two seem more like yourselves lately." And for the first time in a long while, I smiled without guilt. I still thought of Jake now and then, not with longing, but with gratitude. His presence had shaken me from a numbness I hadn't realized I'd sunk into. But the chapter we had briefly shared felt closed now, not with regret, but with quiet understanding. Sometimes people come into your life not to stay, but to wake you up, and I had awakened to the ache I'd ignored, to the man I had once loved deeply, and maybe still did, to the possibility that healing doesn't mean going back, but going forward, together. Months passed. The seasons shifted quietly around us, spring giving way to summer, and with it, a sense of renewal we hadn't felt in years. Our home no longer felt like a place we merely occupied. It began to feel like ours again. Not because everything was perfect, but because we were finally present in it, honestly, consciously. David and I continued our counseling sessions. They were still challenging at times, but less raw. More reflective. The blame that once sat heavily between us had softened into understanding. We learned to speak without defense. To listen without interruption. Some days we fell into old patterns, but we knew now how to find our way back. We began to do simple things together again: grocery shopping, cooking dinner, taking walks at dusk. The activities weren't extraordinary, but the intention behind them made all the difference. Slowly, the walls came down. The tenderness returned, not with drama, but with gentle constancy. One Saturday, as the three of us sat beneath the backyard pergola, the same one I had decorated months ago, Lucas joked about how nervous he was to start college. David squeezed my hand under the table, a quiet reminder that we were still here, still choosing one another. I smiled, not because the moment was perfect, but because it was real. Later that evening, David and I stood in the kitchen, side by side, cleaning up. The silence between us no longer felt hollow. It was peaceful, companionable. "I've been thinking," he said, drying a plate. "Maybe we should take a weekend away. Just the two of us." I looked at him, surprised, touched. "I'd like that." He nodded, then added, "We lost each other for a while. But I don't think we're beyond repair. I think we're starting again." I felt the truth of that settle into my chest. Not as a rush of emotion, but as a steady warmth. "Yes," I said softly. "We are." In the quiet of the night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood by the window looking out over the garden. The lights Jake and I once hung had been replaced with newer ones, but the memory of that day still lived somewhere in the edges of my heart. Not as a regret, but as a turning point. A reminder of where I had been, and how far I had come. I thought of him sometimes. Briefly. Kindly. He had been a mirror, reflecting parts of myself I had forgotten, reminding me that I was still capable of feeling deeply. But the chapter we shared had closed with grace. What remained now was my own story, and the family I had chosen to fight for. Healing, I had learned, isn't loud. It's made up of small moments. A touch on the shoulder. A shared cup of tea. A conversation where someone listens all the way through. It's choosing, every day, to be present. To be honest. To begin again. And as I turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs toward our bedroom, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace.